I'm Alan Windham, Extension Specialist and Professor of Plant Pathology with UT Extension. I work at the Soil Plant and Pest Center in Nashville, and I'm going to talk to you today about common diseases in an ornamental landscape. So these are all some diseases that we've seen in the lab this summer. It's not unusual to see plant diseases in a garden. I like to say that the only people that have plant diseases are people that grow plants. So you can find some in every garden. So that's not unusual if you have some in your garden. So our first disease is powdery mildew, and powdery mildews are really common on ornamental plants. This happens to be Monarda that has already bloomed, but the mildew is still there. And one thing about powdery mildews is they tend to show up on the same plants from year to year. So the ways that you would avoid powdery mildew, one would be to use a fungicide right as it's starting or just before it starts, and spray the plant to keep the foliage healthy. Your long-term option would be to pick a cultivar or species that's resistant to powdery mildew. So our next disease is downy mildew, and it's quite different than powdery mildew. The downy mildews aren't even true fungi, considered true fungi anymore. So what we have is symptom-wise here are angular yellow spots, but actually if we saw the fungus we would have to flip the leaf over and look on the underside. Cucurbit downy mildews have been really a problem this late summer in Tennessee and fairly widespread. This happens to be on ornamental gourd, but we've gotten samples on pumpkin, on squash, just about any cucurbit. It spreads rapidly, and when it's in the area, you need to spray your plants to prevent them from becoming infected, because it can wipe out a planting or a field in just a few days to a week. So our next disease is rust. This happens to be on rose, which is unusual for Tennessee, but it's some things that it has in common with other rust are the bright yellow to orange pustules where we see spores being produced. So some of the more common rust in Tennessee are the cedar rust that we see on apples and crab apples. A really common rust this year has been cedar quince rust on ornamental pear and hawthorn. And then you'll see leaf rust like this on some wildflowers such as goldenrod and ironweed, and occasionally in certain parts of the country you'll see rust on rose like this, but it's fairly uncommon. The way that rust is usually controlled is with fungicide sprays, and it's just a matter of timing that you spray the crop before the rust shows up to protect it. So our next disease is a leaf spot disease on hydrangea. This is on mophead or hydrangea macrophylla. This is Cercospora leaf spot, and it's very common. At this time of the year, there are lots of Cercospora leaf spots on many different ornamental plants, on phlox, on various trees, and on shrubs like hydrangea. This happens to be, actually with hydrangea, it tends to be worse on those plants that are in full sun and not quite as bad on plants that are in partial to full shade. One thing about leaf spots is there's some that are sporadic in occurrence, there's some that show up every year, and for those that show up every year, it's a matter of using a fungicide to prevent infection. On some plants that are susceptible to leaf spots long term, you might look at a different species or a different cultivar that's resistant to the leaf spot. They're out there, so do some research before you buy. So this is rose. Our next disease is Cercospora leaf spot on rose, and in Tennessee most people are familiar with black spot on rose and the damage that it causes. It's usually black lesions, feathered edges, but this disease is Cercospora leaf spot, which can be just as damaging, cause a lot of leaf drop. You'll see brown to tan angular lesions on the leaves fall off, and it's controlled the same way that you would control black spot, and that's to use a fungicide spray to protect the leaves so that they don't become infected. So our next disease is a little bit of a strange one. This is aster yellows on purple coneflower, and there are two main symptoms. Number one, the petals do not color up as you would expect to see on a normal purple coneflower, but you also have this production of miniature flowers in the flower, which is typical of Aster yellow's infection on purple coneflower. This is a pathogen that's spread by leafhoppers. If you see this in your garden, the plant needs to go because it's a reservoir for the pathogen and can be spread to your healthy coneflowers. So I have here a healthy coneflower with normal colored petals. It's a little late in the season, so it doesn't look terrific, but you can tell the difference between it and the one that's infected with Aster yellows. So another type of plant disease that's fairly common in ornamentals are virus diseases, and there are different symptoms that you might see. There are mosaics, there's leaf etching, line patterns, but one of the common symptoms that we see on some plants are ring spots. And there's certain groups of viruses that can cause that. One of the more common viruses that causes ring spots, symptoms like this on herbaceous perennials, is tomato spotted wilt virus, and it's spread by thrips. Sometimes just this plant's been in the landscape a long time. Sometimes the longer it's been in the landscape, it's not unusual for it to become infected with a virus. However, if it still looks healthy otherwise, I would just leave it in the garden. It's not much, generally it's not going to spread to your other hostas quickly. I know that I have a little hosta virus garden at home for teaching, and it hasn't spread rapidly at all. So those are some common plant diseases that we've seen at the Soil Plant and Pest Center this year. Like I said, it's not unusual to find some plant diseases in every garden. If you would like to learn more about diseases and how to identify them and how to control them, follow our Facebook page. It's the Soil Plant and Pest Center on Facebook, or follow me on Twitter at UTPlantDoc, D-O-C. If you would like to learn more about the beautiful plants here at the UT Plateau Research and Education Center, follow them and the UT Gardens and the Discovery Garden on Facebook.